People are gonna be trickling in, but we will go ahead and get started since we also have an audience online. I'm gonna take a bit longer to do the introduction tonight because this is our last event after a 6-year run. So there's a lot of people to thank and acknowledge. First of all, I want to thank Suzanne Shanahan, who's the director of the Institute for Social Concerns, where we are tonight, for her generous co-sponsorship and for extending to us the gift of time, space, and the Institute's precious human resources. So thank you, Judy and Todd, for all your work helping us get tonight going. Thank you also to the Franco Family Institute for the Liberal Arts and the Public Good for funding our final year of programming. As many of you know, Literatures of Annihilation, Exile, and Resistance is a research collective, lecture series, and digital archive devoted to contemporary literature shaped by exile and human rights abuses. The series began in 2020 during the pandemic, with the aim of bringing Southwest Asian and North African writers and thinkers into conversation with American writers and scholars in order to imagine new modes of literary production and collaboration across borders. Tonight's event is especially meaningful as it marks the culmination of 6 years of growth. Over that time, we evolved from a monthly online lecture series with a global following into a multi-institutional international network. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the members of our collective and also our graduate students who have been really important in helping run book clubs, attending events, engaging deeply with our writers. So Adeline Perriman, Nikita Thomas, Kyla Walker, and Spencer French. But our faculty at Notre Dame, Allison Rice, Mark Sanders, Ibrahim Musa, Atalia Omer, Perrin Goral, Francisco Robles, Mehak Khan, Olivier Morel, Ernesto Verdeja, Asher Kaufman, Liam Kruger, and Aria Hernandez-Webster. And from outside of Notre Dame, Hannah Morgenstern from Cambridge University, Amir Ahmadi Aryan from Binghamton, Brandon Hobson from New Mexico State University and the Institute of American Indian Arts, Sinan Antoun from NYU, Amiel Alkali from CUNY, and Pierce Alquist from the Transnational Literature Series in Boston. We came together from across the world with a shared sense of purpose, to cultivate reparative justice at a time when the arc of history is bending away from it. It is a special honor and a privilege to close our series with Deborah Jackson Taffa. Whiskey Tender is a coming-of-age memoir that situates the story of a mixed tribe indigenous family within the legal and historical architectures that have worked to dispossess indigenous nations of land, language, and life worlds. What is extraordinary about the book is not only its clarity, but its capacity to stage an encounter between the intimate and the structural, between private experience and public power. Taffa shows us how language mediates sovereignty and belonging, and how education itself becomes a site of translation, at once a means of survival and a mechanism of erasure. The parental commitment to education emerges in her work as both an act of protection and a profound negotiation with loss, where entry into stability requires a partial relinquishing of the ancestral self. The questions that animate Whiskey Tender are also the questions that have guided this series from the beginning, questions we have returned to in different forms across geographies, histories, and aesthetic traditions. What is a responsible aesthetic of documentation, countermapping, and commemoration in the face of atrocity? How do artistic practices confront displacement by creating new sites of memory and knowledge? How do we learn to read what has been made to disappear? And how do we document absence itself? These are not abstract questions. They emerge from ongoing histories we are living through and implicated in. And what Taffa's work makes unmistakably clear is that the archive is not only a repository of the past, but a living ethical practice, a way of refusing erasure, of naming what has been concealed, and of carrying forward forms of knowledge that have been systematically threatened. Whiskey Tender is, in this sense, a work of restoration. It brings into view what has been obscured and asks us not only to witness, but to reckon with history, with responsibility, and with ourselves. I want to close by sharing a few reflections from my students whose readings of Taffa's work remind us that literature makes transformation possible in its readers. These are quotes. Your courage in reclaiming the iconic American story and refusing to let Indigenous history remain a sanitized footnote has challenged me to confront the persistent shadows of our shared past. Your writing transforms historical trauma into a testament of grace, reminding us that survival itself is a profound act of beauty. Taffa writes in a way that moves beyond the visible world, engaging the spiritual and the unseen. Taffa helped me understand the personal consequences of colonialism, the ways in which the United States advanced its goals through the erasure of Native spiritual and cultural histories. This is a story that younger generations need to know. These responses speak to the force of Taffa's work, its ability to open new ways of seeing, to unsettle inherited narratives, and to insist on a more honest and expansive account of the American story. Deborah Jackson Taffa is the director of the MFA Creative Writing Program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Her memoir, Whiskey Tender, was a finalist for the 2024 National Book Award and longlisted for the 2025 Carnegie Medal of Excellence in Nonfiction. She's a 2024 NEA Fellow and the recipient of the 2022 Penn Jean Stein Grant for Literary Oral History, and has received fellowships from Tin House, the University of Iowa, MacDowell, the Rona Jaffe Foundation, the Ellen Meloy Fund, and the New York State Summer Writers Institute. She is a citizen of the Yuma Nation and Laguna Pueblo, and earned her nonfiction MFA in Iowa City. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Jackson Taffa.
Thank you all for having me at this dignified university. My grandfather would be so proud of me if he knew I was here. I'm sure he's watching from somewhere. He was a major Notre Dame fan, if you can believe that. So there are Arizona natives who are crazy about you, a very large family. I am, as Azareen said, from the Yuma Nation in Southern California and from Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico on my father's side. And my mother's side, I am from a large Hispanic family in Socorro, New Mexico. So my mom is one of 15 kids and my father is one of 10 kids. And I was one of 7 children. So we have very, very large families and very humble beginnings. The only other thing I would say before I read a small section of the book and we move forward with our conversation is that I am a first-generation graduate. And when I say that I'm a first-generation graduate, I know most people think I'm talking about college. I'm actually a first-generation high school graduate if you don't count Indian boarding schools. And so for me to be here today, for me to have found a voice, for me to have persisted and arrived at a place where I wrote a book, it says a lot, I think, about my inheritance. You might think that coming from a family like mine that my parents did not emphasize the importance of an education, but that would not be true. They really wanted us to excel, and they pushed us a great deal. They said we had to give 110% because we were Native, and then that was the only way that we would make it. And they really believed in America as a meritocracy, which I think for many of us today seems quaint, given what's happening politically.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Fix your microphone.
Oh, all right. There we go. They really believed in America as a meritocracy. And I know that some of us believe that that's quaint, given what the United States is currently going through, but they pushed us to excel. And, you know, for many years, I did not I disidentified with the goal of academia as a pursuit because my people's history had been so thoroughly erased from my high school curriculum. And every time I read about it, it was at the juncture of our death and destruction, which is a terrible place to start a child with their history. I really wish they had taught us about the complicated astronomies and math and architecture that it took to build a place like Chaco Canyon or Chichen Itza or Machu Picchu. I wish they had taught us that 2/3 of the world's crops came from the Americas. I wish they had taught us that my people had a concept of childhood when a lot of children in Europe were being forced into child labor. There was virtually nothing positive that they taught me when I was in high school. It was always so depressing and sad. All of which is to say I came to the table very late. I did not go back to get my undergraduate degree until I was 35. I did not go to graduate school until I was 39. And I did not publish this book until I was in my 50s. So just as a way of telling you a little bit about myself. The last time I went home to the reservation was for my mother's funeral. My father was driving, and as we crossed the southern Arizona desert following the transport van that carried her body, I fell into a sandstorm dream. Dust blew, obscuring the highway, and small pebbles pecked the car like hail. I was driving alone in my dream and wanted to keep up with my mother, but the wind blew the sand so thick it darkened the earth, and I had to slow down because the steering wheel pulled through my hands. Though I knew the car might crash into the Badlands, I did not feel afraid. Instead, the sand flying into the headlights mesmerized me, making me forget who I was, where I was, why I had started on this journey. There was no transport van with my mother's body before me, just the wind and darkness and a sense of wonder, the same feeling I had in my earliest years when the earth and the elements and the tiniest creatures were miracles. The storm stopped, and I descended from the car. The sun hung high and blazing, and I looked down the highway to spot a lake shimmering on the empty road. Awake, I would have known the water was a mirage. But in my dream, I was thirsty and walked toward it, still believing with the faith of a child. I grew up in a homeland favored by the Fata Morgana. Long before I understood illusions, I would see Spanish galleons floating over the horizon. For years, many of my ideas about the world were tricks of the environment. "We're here," my father said, waking me. We got out of the car and went to my mother in the transport van. Her eyes had reopened in transit, and she stared at me as if acknowledging that I'd spent a lifetime doubting what I saw. I felt her chastising me with her gaze, as if she were saying I could no longer stay small and invisible, as Indian kids are. I was a 50-year-old woman now, and it was time to grow into more than a ghost child in love with and afraid of mirages. When my parents left their wedding reception, Mom was sober. Dad, of course, drove. He sped toward 4th Avenue, the main thoroughfare in Yuma, cutting into the opposite lane on corners, fishtailing with the groom's finesse. Mom grew scared. She hiked up her wedding dress, reached her long leg over his thigh, and stomped the brake with her high heel shoe. The tires locked up. The car swung wide to the right before spinning them all the way around to the left, showing them the surprised expressions of people in other cars. It was like we were riding on the tilt-a-whirl at the Yuma County Fair, Mom said. The car slammed into the side of a busy downtown bar. The Plymouth's front end was mangled. Steam poured out of the radiator. It was a Sunday afternoon in April 1963, and the day was still light. Afternoon drinkers came flowing out of the bar's smoky interior like rice throwers out of a cathedral in a haze of incense and prayer. Being the eldest of 15 kids had made Mom conspicuous in this small town, and the bar was her father Juan's favorite. So some of the regulars and barflies realized she was a Herrera girl and wanted to know if she was okay. Sirens started up in the distance. A couple of biker chicks helped Mom out of the car, and she stood with them on the sidewalk in front, staring at the damaged headlight and hood. In her hurry to get out, she'd caught the train of her wedding dress in the door, and it had ripped. When she saw the torn fabric, she started crying. She told us, "I could see your father through the window of the car with his forehead rested on the wheel, and I knew exactly what he was thinking." Dad was from the Yuma reservation across the train tracks and river, and he was worried the town cops were going to book him again. But when the cops pulled up at the accident scene and looked at Mom, plopped on the curb in a puff of white satin, mascara running down her cheeks, they decided to be merciful and let Dad go. Mom said they felt sorry for her because she was a good, local, Catholic girl who'd married a crazy Indian. When Dad walked in the front door and heard her telling us the story, he laughed and said she was wrong. He said the cops let him go, not because they pitied her, but because Mom was beautiful and pretty people got away with shit. He pulled off his black boots and lifted his holy socks onto the coffee table. He put his arm around her and said getting away scot-free on their wedding day was the first sign Mom's charm would work magic in his life, like a lucky rabbit's foot or a powerful tattoo. He reminded Mom how romantic he'd been at their wedding, how he'd refused to let her sisters decorate the car with do-it-yourself flowers because the phony tissue paper looked too common for a woman of her caliber. Instead, he and his brothers had performed a top-secret midnight operation, sneaking into St. Thomas Indian Mission's garden on the reservation, where they cut a bunch of roses to string over the roof of the car. Mom groaned, "Don't brag about stealing from the church." But the two of them laughed, and Dad went in the kitchen to grab a snack. Mom's protestations never fooled me. She loved the memory of the stolen roses, as well as Dad's claim that her beauty swayed the cops. But what made her light up especially was the way he called her his lucky charm. This is how my parents twisted bad things around, seeing the appearances of events in funhouse mirrors, stretching memories tall and pretty when they were really goofy and squat. They knew a story could be told in various ways, and this is how they chose to shape theirs, and how they would teach me to shape mine as well, by molding their wedding day car accident into their first blessing as a couple. And I'm just going to end with this last little piece at the end of the book that is my sort of prayer that I finish with. We are at home on this planet when we feel the sacred places rising up through our feet, when we embrace the mountains and desert arroyos as holy. The ancient ones walk beside us, and all we must do is keep our fingers on the pulse of music. If we listen, we can hear it rising up from the planet, the sound of the spirit that was, is, and always will be. Thank you.
So thank you so much for being here with us and for writing this incredible book. There's so much in this book. I mean, there's so much incredible legal history. There's so much personal history. There's the story of telling the book itself and of learning what the book is as it's unfolding. and there's just the story of this family's love for one another. They're moving between spaces from the Yuma reservation to Navajo territories. It's such a rich book. It's very difficult to actually try to convey what it is in a kind of elevator pitch. So we'll talk through some of the layers. But I actually wanted to start with the opening sequence that you read from, where you described the last time you went home to the reservation. And the writing, as you guys heard, kind of lives inside of this liminal space, this dream space. And this is something that reoccurs throughout the book. And you, as the protagonist, come to understand this illusion, as you call it, right? Where the veil between the seen and the unseen world thins, and you begin to receive messages from the other side, from your mother in particular, right? In this section, where she's telling you to stop being a ghost child, to stop being invisible. And in this way, death becomes a guide and an invitation to listen to the stories of your ancestors. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the importance of these visions and how they related to the process of writing the book itself. You write that history takes time to come into focus for a Native child in an assimilated family, and then much later, my knowledge of history over the course of my childhood came together like a puzzle, one edifying piece at a time.
Death is such a big part of an Indigenous child's experience of the world. And when I wrote the book, the 4 sequences that you're talking about that kind of embedded in our tribal philosophy of the Ikama experience, which is a sort of a dream experience of the world, and an extreme non-materialistic approach to being alive. So an example of this is when our ancestors die, when my family members die, we build a big pit in their backyard, and everything they own gets burned. And we used to even burn the house. And my grandmother's house, the federal government forbid us to do this at a certain point, but my grandmother's house, my great-grandmother's house, was the last house that had been grandfathered in. And they burned it down in 1987, 86, when I was in high school when she died. And we lost all of her regalia, all of the beautiful things that she had made. It was all lost, because we're not supposed to grasp at the material world, which was confounding for me when I got 3/4 of the way through the book and I realized that this book is doing the exact opposite of what our tribal belief is. We're not supposed to preserve things, and I'm preserving my family history here, which is a contradiction. But those were written at the very end. Mm-hmm. So I wrote the entire book, and then my editor said, what would you like to do? Are you going to change anything? And I thought, I'm going to add these 4 interstitials. And I think the only other thing I would say about that, other than death being a profound sort of teaching aspect of my life, is that my mother was fairly non-present in the book until she died. And she died at the beginning of COVID. And I went through this intense period of mourning because we never had a good relationship. My mother always said she was Hispanic. She really wanted her identity to be embedded in Spain. And of course, if you're from the Southwest and you're Latina or Chicana or Mexican, you have indigenous blood, and her family always rejected that lineage. And because I identified as Native always since I was a small child, my mother and I, we didn't get along. And I think it was because I knew that we would never resolve our differences after she died, that I was very panicky and not feeling good. And it took me a few months to get kind of stable again after she died. And when I got back to my desk and started working on the book, she emerged on the page in such a vivid way. It changed the entire book. Mm-hmm. And so the way that you perceive that there was a communication going on, absolutely true. Books are a strange semi-intellectual feat that we accomplish. There's a whole other aspect of writing a book, of creating literature, that is beyond intellectual choices. It's a way of feeling your way into material. And I don't think the book could be what it is today if it hadn't been for my mother leaving us at that juncture, oddly.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I want to talk about her and the silences and the relationship between the two of you and how it relates very specifically to sort of the long history of the Laguna Pueblo. But, you know, you mentioned the funeral rituals, and this is skipping really a lot farther ahead than I intended to, but
I'm sorry.
No, we can absolutely, we should move around laterally and liminally. The sort of, there's an experience that you relate when you're in Catholic school and watching the realtor's funeral. Like, the class is forced to attend this funeral by the nuns, and it's very beautifully described as a sort of like performance of restraint, right? Where you're watching the family members of the deceased hold in their pain and their tears, and to the point where you perceive this buried earthquake inside of them. And then, you know, the line that stuck out to me was like, isn't this going to eventually make them sick, right? This holding on so tightly. And then when we go to the funeral on the reservation and we see the cry house, and these rituals, right, of accompanying the dead as they cross the threshold, there is actually like being accompanied in the weeping, which reminded me a lot of what happens like in Iranian culture, where you have like other people who are professional mourners who actually help start crying so that they give permission to the family members to weep publicly and to kind of release the emotions. And I don't know, the way that you talked about those differences, it felt like such an important pivotal moment in your consciousness in terms of relating to like the education system that was maybe confining your knowledge to a very particular like system, and then death being actually the avenue through which you realize that something's been concealed from you and there's another way of existing in the world.
Yes, that's very perceptive as well. I mean, there was a silencing that was happening in my family. And as a small child, you sense that there's so much more there, because I left the reservation when I was 6 or 7 years old. And so I was removed from that large family that I told you about, and suddenly I was in a Catholic school because my father and mother said, New Mexico public schools are the worst in the country, and there's no way that you're going to go there. You have to go to a Catholic school. And the nuns gave us an excellent education, but they talked a lot about manifest destiny, and they talked a lot about, you know, all of the things that you would expect. And when we would go back to the reservation, I would catch glimpses of these beautiful ceremonies and these rites of passage that were so much more meaningful. Like for me as a teenager, to have my rite of passage be going to prom or getting my driver's license at the mall, like I couldn't help but compare and say, but back in the day, we had these wonderful rites of passages where I knew some Navajo girls that they would do the run. They run to the east one day, they run to the north, they run to the west, then they're kind of buried in the earth for their first menstruation. They still practice it, and I was taken away from all of that, and no one talked about it. It took me a long time to kind of forgive my parents and to figure it out. And I think for them growing up in the Jim Crow era, my father had really been scared straight. He was tried and convicted of manslaughter as a minor for a car accident that he had. His friend died, and he was afraid. He knew how to say yes, ma'am. He knew how to say no, ma'am. And then, you know, my grandparents had been taken to Indian boarding school, and that creates sort of a generational, you know, the Grand Canyon, because they don't teach the children the myths and the ceremonies. And when they came home, they were kind of, I think, not able to talk about the traumatizing experience. A lot of us have uncles and aunts who went to war. They were in Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan. And when they first come back, they don't have language for what they've endured. And they're very quiet for a long time before they can kind of start talking about it. That's what I think happened to my grandparents' generation coming home from Indian boarding schools. And then the mortality rate was so low that some of them would die before the traditions were passed on. So in my family, it was like, we are this country's guilty conscience. We are the skeletons in the closet, and we don't complain, because if we complain or we blame historic oppression, we're making ourselves victims. The only thing you can do is pull yourself up, by your bootstraps and work really, really hard. You have to be better than everybody else. That was what my parents had adopted as their philosophy. And so much like at the funeral where I saw people holding in, it felt like my whole family was holding in. And when I went to the reservation and saw the professional criers and saw the mourning, and it made all of us cry. And the funeral goes all night, and the cremation happens at sunrise, and they take the bodies out into the cemetery, and we put them on the wood, and we, it's beautiful, beautiful thing, but it broke something open inside of me and made me realize, I'm not sure that I want what my parents are telling me I have to have. I'm not sure that I want to do what they're telling me I have to do. They didn't do it. So why do I have to do it? I was always the rebellious, bratty one in my family, as you can hear, that wouldn't listen to my mom and dad.
Well, thankfully. Your mom's character, I mean, I speak of her as a character because she's in the book as such, but just her personality is more what I mean, is kind of lives in contrast to your father's. And I was just looking at my notes, because there's a passage that I'll find that I wanted to read from, where your father tells you that your understanding of what it means to be human has to come from your mother and her ancestry. And then, you realize that she's the silent one, and there's this tension between the two of you. And earlier in the book, you sort of say holding on to mom was like holding on to water. So I wanted to, there's a very rich history of Laguna Pueblo throughout the book. So, I love learning about these recovered histories, and there's just a lot of it. So Laguna Pueblo, your parents were from, on your mother's side, Socorro, which is, you said, 100 miles south of Laguna. And sort of her ancestry was shaped by the violence inflicted by Juan de Oñato, who was a rich silver baron from Mexico, who was actually saved by a group of Piara Indians while he was almost about to drown in the Jornada del Muerto desert. And then, of course, as the story goes, he established a silver mine in Socorro and enslaved people, gifting them to Spanish colonists. He mutilated a lot of people. And over centuries of this kind of abuse, it led to people becoming very afraid of acknowledging their indigenous roots. And the enslaved population became known as genizaros. Can you talk a bit about that specific history, the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, and maybe how your understanding of your mom's silence shifted or continues to shift, right? Because I feel like it can appear as protection, and it can appear as a wounding, and yeah. Yeah,
it's been a process of discovery because they didn't teach us this in schools. So, the Emancipation Proclamation that freed Black Americans in the South occurred before New Mexico and Arizona were part of the United States. We were still part of Mexico. So after the purchase of those states, BIA, or Bureau of Indian Affairs officers, came out through the West, and they wrote back to Washington and said, we have a problem. There are still many, many slaves in the Southwest. They're native slaves. And since the history of Juan de Oñate, who came north thinking he was going to find the city of gold, right, and didn't, but he found another type of gold. He found the most peaceful native pueblos that he could enslave and have, they built missions, they dug mines, and he could enslave them. And other tribes became involved in the slave trade. So Comanche and Navajo people would often raid Pueblo villages and steal children, and they would give them to the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church would sell them to Spanish households. And these kids were known to be native, but they had no idea of knowing what tribe they came from. So when the US government freed them, finally, in the Peonage Act that came after the Emancipation Proclamation, they didn't know how to go back to their home tribes. So they set up in villages, near Spanish villages, and this is well documented. Socorro is one, Truchas, Chimayo. There are a lot of small northern New Mexican villages that became the stronghold of Genízaro people who knew they were native in their bloodlines, but spoke Spanish because they had worked in Spanish homes for so long that they had lost their own languages. And so many, many, many people in northern New Mexico have a mixture of Hispanic and native bloodlines. Not everybody knows which tribe they came from. And this was my mother's family circumstance. Unfortunately, because of the pressures of notions of white superiority, they oftentimes will deny it. So they call themselves Hispanic, and they don't want to think about that. And that was the situation with my mother's family. And for me, it was very difficult because I would hear from my mother's family criticisms of my father, who, by all accounts, took care of my mother's family because my grandmother was very poor and she had so many children. And whenever we would go visit her, he would give her money and he bought her cars. And he was so generous and so kind. Native people often think communally. We're not, we take care of each other. And he really took very good care of her. And I already had children of my own by the time I fully understood the history. I had to go back and research and engage in, dig into libraries and interview people and go and sit with my grandfather's sisters and take notes and ask many questions. It took me decades to write this book. I think even before I knew I was writing the book, I was seeking out curatives for my identity because I felt so much internal pressure to figure out this really liminal identity that I had that I didn't know where I belonged. Because like you said, my father always told us he comes from a matrilineal tribe and you're supposed to get your identity from your mother's bloodlines. But we had no quinceañera. She didn't really do the Mexican sort of celebrations. She found all of her identity in the Catholic Church. And so as a child, I went to Mass 6 days a week. We went to Mass a lot. We went and sat on Fridays during Lent in the church during the day and mourned the passing of Christ. And it was like, and my father's lineage kind of played in that because a lot of the pueblos, including Laguna Pueblo, they have an indigenous Catholicism that they practice that is very much the Catholicism of liberation theology. So it's social justice oriented. It believes that Jesus helped the poor and was with the lepers and the prostitutes. And that was the version of Catholicism I grew up with. And it took me a long time to realize that the Catholic Church is different all over the world. Depending on where you go, the flavor of the church is very different. So my father didn't protest when my mother kind of took the strong, and she was good in many ways in that she never drank alcohol, so she helped my father, who probably would have had a very difficult time if he had married a woman who did like to drink. So it took me a long time to appreciate my mother, though, in her efforts because she was incredibly rigid and strict and very afraid, made clear distinctions between venial sins and mortal sins. And have you been to confession? You missed church last Sunday. If you happen to die in a car accident, you're going to go to hell. It was very rules oriented and very, very much about the dogma of, the Catholic Church. It was hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And also just the way that she you portray her as not understanding, like if you can pass, why would you choose to attach yourself to your indigenous identity, right? And there's also like interesting, the car accident, because there's so many car accidents in this book. But which also inform your dad's entire outlook and the way that he ends up shaping you guys through education and the value of instilling an education in you. So your dad's story is so interesting. There's multiple sort of police profiling incidents. He's incarcerated for some time. And it intersects, of course, with violence of like enforced disappearances on reservations, right? You write that everybody, welcome to the world of Indian reservations where nearly everyone knows someone who has gone missing. And your father's early life was interrupted by this kind of violence. And also later, you write about the tactics of the Bureau of Indian Affairs to relocate young natives to big cities through the Indian Relocation Act. And that also shapes the whole arc of your family history, right? So can you talk to those of us here who haven't read the book about that history and your father's, just his challenges and his resilience in the eventual relocation when he does finally find a job in his profession, at the Four Corners power plant, which is in Navajo land. And then I'll just throw this out there as well, because one of the things that he negotiates and you later are negotiating in Farmington is understanding how the Diné tribes and the Navajo peoples are completely different in the way that they navigated, right, colonialism, and then also the way that the Four Corners power plant even came to be, right, through negotiations, and the ways that they practiced their sovereignty under such oppression and duress, and the way that your father is then like living inside of that ecosystem in the power plant, and it's so fascinating. I don't want to give the book away, but
I mean, all tribes are different. That's the issue with us not knowing the histories, is you really can't flatten over 500 independent nations with very distinct languages and philosophies and cultures and just give them this little misnomer Indian and think that it's sufficient. Everyone met their sort of moment of subjugation to the US government in a different way. And the Diné Navajo benefited from having that happen to them later, and they got a very big land mass it's the largest native reservation in the country, which means that if your grandma lives in the middle of Ganado, which is a tiny little, town in the middle of this sea of Diné people, your language, your culture, your traditions, your sheep herding, it can stay very healthy. Instead, my father grew up on the Yuma Indian Reservation, which met its demise very early on by virtue of the gold rush and the 49ers, who came in these large swarms across the country to this one little bend, like a Z, in the Colorado River, which before the 7 dams was like a raging waterway that you couldn't swim across without drowning. So they come through, and my ancestors, my father's ancestors, had always taken advantage of the delta. So every spring, the river busted out of its course and left really fertile soil in the alluvial plain. They would go out and plant all of their seeds, and they just had to sit back, and they grew a ton of crops. We're talking about my ancestors were like 6 feet, 6'4", very tall, over 2,000 calories a day easily, right? Until the 49ers came through and trampled all of their crops and fed all of their food to their cattle. And they were reduced to helping them with their cattle, trying to swim them across to the other side to go to California, because we were very good swimmers. And Mexican banditos came up, and there was a lot of killing and treachery during this era because people were trying to rob the 49ers. The US Army sent out a battalion, and they set up Fort Yuma. That was designed to protect us, to protect the tribe, to protect the 49ers, to stop all the fighting. So we were bowed very, very early. In that history, what's important to know is, unlike most native tribes that are matrilineal, The Yuma are patrilineal, and that means they are very warfaring. You had to be really strong to survive in that sort of desert heat. And the men were kind of the ruffians who ran things. And so I think when you have all of that robbed from you, you know, the psychoanalyst Erik Erikson dubbed the term identity crisis based on his own life. He was a blonde Jew who never fit in, but he based it on his study of the Lakota and the Yurok people. That's how he coined the term identity crisis. He said, these are people that cannot follow in their father or their grandfather or great-grandfather's footsteps. My grandpa was a lawyer, I'm going to be a lawyer. There's none of that. My grandfather was a buffalo hunter, there are no more bison. I can't do that. There's a void of possibility for what you can become. You have to reinvent yourself completely. And it results in two things, according to his studies. One is deflated, dejected, unable to believe that the old world is gone. And that looks like a fatalistic, depressive, diabetes, alcoholism, you just sit there. The other is the bar brawl, the car accidents, the sort of feisty, I'm gonna show everyone how angry I am by hurting myself, essentially. And Erik Erikson thought that that was probably the healthier way to go about it. Like this sort of a fiery resistance and the bar brawls was actually emblematic of more of an urge to live and survive than the opposite. My father and his brothers definitely took that route, and that's why you see so many of them getting hurt. And I think my grandparents knew that. So when the US government came up with this Public Law 959, which is the Relocation Act, the Indian Relocation Act, that was designed to train Native people to do the jobs that nobody else wanted. So mechanical jobs, welding jobs, the jobs that would land you in a factory or a power plant. My grandparents said, all of our children should do this program. Even though it's designed to take you away from the reservation, we don't want your kids to go without food like you guys did. Like my dad did not have an adequate diet as a child. He did not have a pair of shoes until he was 7 years old. He was very, very impoverished for somebody growing up. He was 8 in 1950. They were poor. And so my father went to welding school. And that ended up that he got a job for a coal-fired power plant on the Navajo reservation. And you would think that Navajo people would hate the idea of a polluting power plant on their land, but they were in the same situation where like, we're trying to find a way to feed our children and our grandchildren. We're gonna build this power plant, and we're going to build it with the agreement that there's Indian preference in hiring, which is how my dad got the job. And so 12 hours from Southern California, driving up through Arizona, we landed in this little town in the Four Corners called Farmington, New Mexico, near Shiprock. And this little town, when we landed and got there, was known as the Selma, Alabama of the Southwest. There was a lot of violence happening between the Texas oil field hands that had moved there for work and the Dene people. And in that context, we didn't fit in. Because like, you know, I had a lot of Navajo guy friends, and they were like, I can't date that Navajo girl because she comes from the Bitterwater clan, and I'm not allowed to date women from the Bitterwater clan. I can only date people from this clan and that clan, but not this clan and that clan. And they were so specific about who they could marry, and who they looked at me and they were like, we don't even know what you are. Like, you're a quarter Yuma, quarter Laguna Pueblo. They were just like, they barely counted me as Native. And clearly I didn't fit in with the Mormon kids from Utah or the Texas oil field kids. So I was very much like, I didn't know where I fit. It was a very lonely childhood. And my sisters were like, play sports and, you know, eat hot dogs and go to Mexico and Cancun for spring break.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't want any of that. And so when I was really little, they would tease me on the reservation. They would be like, my dad would be like, the elders are taking a photo. And they would be like, go on, Dee Dee, go get in the picture with the elders. And I would be like, don't make fun of me. And they were like, you're always talking about, you know, I always wanted Native traditions. And I always sat with the elders and I always asked questions. They could have cared less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you really, I mean, the story of the book is also the story of this journey of being the way you are and having to deal with this lack of feeling of being anchored anywhere or of belonging or of maybe anyone nurturing and sustaining. your curiosity, your father and Grandma Estelle, like, yes, definitely presences that nurtured that desire for you to feel connected, right?
Yeah.
And I often feel like writers are actually born in these conditions of like absence, right? You have like a very sensitive soul. You pick up on things like these buried histories feel unbearable to you, and other people are just like out having a party.
They don't care.
And you're like, I have to recover my language. And
know.
you know, it's like a kind of, it's beautiful because somebody has to carry that forward. And the way, the ending of the book is so beautiful. You read briefly from it, but it is, in a sense, you realize that, you know, you haven't been alone, right? Like you were guided the whole time by your ancestors and then your mother as well, and that they've always been present. And
it's painful, you know, and I think the other thing to note is that now we have social media and you see a lot of active social activists who are Native and they have kind of found each other. But I was growing up in the Reagan administration, and it was not a popular thing to be that kid that was like, I'm doing this. Everyone thought it was odd. It was a painful thing. And I think you're right. I think that it's the mark of an artist and a writer often who feels this really thin wall between the world we live in and the next world.
Yeah.
And we hear ancestral voices and we want to set the record straight. We want to witness, we want to testify. We want to celebrate value systems that belong to cultures that were beautiful cultures and very worthwhile, and they were completely squashed.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, one thing that I talk a lot about with like my students is you can't be a writer and not get your heart broken at some point, right? Like the actual being a steward of literature, and like especially if you're carrying forward a legacy or you're recovering a history, at some point, right, it's burdensome and it's painful, and not everybody is going to understand, right? Especially when you're dealing with like centuries of silencing and you're the one who's uncovering, and you know, somebody along the way will punish you, and like you were punished many times, you know, along the way, but just through the education system, like in school, through, you know, friendships, and your sisters maybe not even fully understanding. But one thing that is so beautiful in the book is like the presence of animals. And I do want to come back to the land and the way that animals are actually used to destroy the land and undermine these traditional life forms of survival. But there's also dogs and cats, and there's one dog in particular that just stole my heart. Do you want to talk about him?
Yeah, so it was in a time when I think my awareness was burgeoning.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I think early childhood is such an odd time to try to remember because you don't have moving pictures, you have still photos. And, you know, you're 6 or 7 by the time your memories really become kind of, you can put them in context. And something happens around that age when you're in the 1st or 2nd grade, when you perceive that things are off. You know, I think Bell Hooks said any kid who grows up in sort of an oppressed state from a marginalized community is a theorist by the time they're 7. Because to survive, you're always watching to see, like, is my dad gonna get in a fight with this guy that just called me, you know, like a pejorative at the park, and you're hoping your dad doesn't get in a fight. You see all of this tension, and you don't know how to, you don't know the historic explanation for it. And so my awareness was really emerging, and my teacher cast me as England in a school play, and another girl got to be America. And I could see like some of the Native parents in the audience that looked kind of sad, but my parents didn't say anything. Again, they really didn't want us to be victims, and they did. So it was just this very confusing year. A lot of painful things were happening. And my father got to babysit Lester Charlie's dog, this guy that lived way out, almost all the way to Shiprock in a town called Waterflow. And it was a beautiful Dalmatian, like a purebred. And I had seen a lot of dogs growing up. We have a lot of res dogs, but they're little mutts running around. And this dog was so regal and beautiful. And I'm playing a little bit with like sort of the notion of what purebred is and what a half-breed is and all of this. But I spent a lot of time in the backyard with this little dog, and animals are so funny. They can feel when you're hurt and you're wounded. And I suppose that this dog didn't have a lot of attention at home already. And so we bonded. So in this 10 days that I was going through a lot of confusing incidents at school with this play and this teacher, I was in the backyard a lot with this little dog. And it culminates kind of in some real disappointment. The dog goes home, and maybe 3 or 4 days after my father returns the dog to his friend, the dog shows up at the back gate. And my mom and dad are like, oh my God, that dog walked 20 miles to come back and see her. And I ran outside and opened the gate, and the dog was licking me all over the face. And my dad went inside to call his friend and was like, your dog is at my house. And was shocked that he had gone so far. It was incredible, you know? And it's so funny because my dad is 85 years old now. And he's still, if you read the book, you'll see what a remarkable man he has. A mark of that is that he started college classes at the age of 81 at Thana Otham Community College. He takes one class a semester online because my mother passed and he's trying to find a way to stay in community. So he wrote poetry once, but like he's doing different things. And when he read the book, he loved the memory of the Dalmatian, which is, I think it's sweet that you think it's so touched you.
I think animals, like the way I've related to them my whole life is that they actually do cross the boundary between the seen and the unseen. And they're so embodied, right? And they live in sensory experience, which at the end of the book, you say like, that is what your grandmother taught you, is that you have to live deeply inside sensory experience, and that's how you preserve, right? And animals do that. That's their primary nature, right? And I was also very confused at that age. So we had just like moved back to Iran, and I was always like hanging out with other people's dogs, and that was a no-no, you know, in my family. And I once said something like, somebody asked me, an elder asked me, what was the best thing about this party we went to in the countryside? And I said, the German Shepherd. And I was in a lot of trouble for saying that because I had like undermined the humans. But I actually think animals are ahead of us in some ways because they're not so caught up in storylines. They're not so, you know, they're just in the moment, and they mirror so much back to us. And that you sort of come to understand like your own struggle with not being like a pure from a single indigenous tribal culture through your interactions with the Dalmatian. And you know, and
I mean, what you're saying about like, there are a lot of false narratives that we have come to believe, and it's scary that we just accept it as a society. Like for a long time, this idea of limitless resources and limitless growth, like a car in every garage, a chicken in every pot. It's impossible. And the other thing is the centrality of human beings, that the world is here for us, and that we can damage like the ocean, and we can kill all of the humpback whales, and we can destroy, you know, what they did to the bison, for example, is horrific. And that we can continue to affect the balance for our own purposes, and that it won't eventually circle back and bite us, you know? So in my culture, you're absolutely right. It's similar to yours in that when we talk about animals, we talk about them as our older siblings, not our younger siblings. We're not taking care of them. They're teaching us. So if you observe the beaver, or if you observe the animals, we learn things from them. Much like if you were paying attention and there was a tsunami coming and all the dogs took off for high land, or the horses or whatever, you would say, oh, the water is gone and all the animals are running. And I don't know why, but I'll follow them. You know, it's like they do know more than we do in many ways. You know, but so
and there's just, you know, we're a minority as a species, really. Even though I think we can do everything with brute force, like these systems are a lot more powerful, and eventually, you know, it will break. I mean, maybe I'll ask one more question and then we'll open it up. But I did, you know, you're talking about like also the eventual consequences of all this is the kind of climate catastrophe that we're living in now. And I think for those of you who, are going to read the book, it really catalogs like how legal history and land history and intersect, right, to bring us to where we are here, where the land is actually just transactional and an object of like late capitalism, right? It's not a being onto itself, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just going to read a couple little passages about the 49ers, the gold rush, right? Like a great human locust storm, the 49ers trampled my tribe's squash, corn, pumpkin, and beans. Facing hardship themselves, they let their cattle graze on the tribe's provisions, leaving behind crushed plants and a desperate population on the brink of starvation. And then, we have built around the San Juan gas pipeline, the Four Corners region boomed in the 1960s after the US government teamed up with El Paso Electric to detonate an underground nuclear bomb east of town, fracturing the Earth's bedrock to free natural gas. So there's a lot of like toxic waste in the land. In 1952, Anaconda Mining Company opened the Jackpile mine 10 miles south of our family's village. There, 3 open-pit uranium mines, some of the largest in the world, remained operable until 1982. Yet when Grandma contracted cancer, no one talked about the possibility of environmental causes for her illness. No one mentioned the poison that bled into the mountain runoff, gathering in the groundwater of wells in the region, affecting Navajo, Hopi, and Laguna Pueblo alike. Just reading this aloud, I'm also just thinking about what's happening in Iran over, just wanting to create these resources or stop other people from having these resources.
When I hear that they're trying to get mines out now, I'm like, underwater mines, I'm like, we don't think of the casualties of animals in the earth in our war scenarios.
Yeah.
It's not even talked about.
Yeah.
It's devastating.
Yeah. Yeah, and just, I feel like this memoir to me felt like a memoir of an education, a memoir of like our history as Americans, the memoir of land itself, the story of the land, and then the story of your family within that. There's just so much, the story of your ancestor, Sarah Winnemucca, so fascinating. We could go on talking, but I definitely want to make sure that everybody here has a chance to maybe ask some questions.
Before we do that, I want to say that I'm grateful that you bring up these sort of environmental, there is a lot in the book, like you said.
Yeah.
I think it's hard to encapsulate in a review. And so people will talk of the coming of age and the resistance to assimilation and like the social functions or the historic policies, governmental policies and histories that are kind of unearthed in the narrative. But not that many people have recognized the aspects of the book that speak to the environment and climate change. And I really appreciate that because to me, it's one of the most important threads is, my grandmother Esther had this really rare form of sinus cancer when I was young, and she refused to have chemotherapy, and she wore these bandages over her cheeks. And the nuclear colonization of northern New Mexico for the security of the United States in World War II, there were a lot of sacrifices that my ancestors made, and it's heartbreaking that people don't remember those. And as a child, maybe in my teens, I started really thinking, I wish that they had listened even a little bit to my ancestors when the country was founded. Because if they had listened to the philosophies that they had about how to treat the earth, even a little bit, and kind of incorporated it, like you meet a stranger, you learn from them, you teach them things, there's an exchange. There was no exchange. And if there had been, we might not have the climate issues that we have today, And I think that comes from going to another place and not caring about that land because it's not your ancestral home. And I say this having married a wonderful man from Milan, Italy. And I remember when I first started going back to Italy with him, and he would be like, wake up, it rained and we're gonna go collect mushrooms. Or it's like chestnut season, put your boots on. And I'm like, what are chestnuts? We don't have chestnuts. You know, I know kind of what they are, but he's like, they're these spiky balls and put your heel and twist and then be careful, don't hurt yourself and pull them out. We'll take them home, we'll roast them. Or it's berries or it's walnuts. And at a certain point, I realized he has an uninterrupted history with his land. Nobody came in and took it away from his family. And if my family had been left alone where we were, they would have been telling me how to go get. All of us have an ancestral land where the relationship that we had with the earth meant we knew exactly when to go pick our berries. We knew exactly when to go get our nuts or our fish or whatever it is we cultivated. And it's that intimate, reciprocal relationship with nature that makes us honest in our humankind, even if all you have in your backyard is a hummingbird feeder that you keep full, or plants that attract the bees, or you're growing your own tomatoes or a basil plant. You're cultivating a healthy relationship with the soil. And I think that's what we need in this day and age. I think we need to have our hands in dirt. In our culture, when you go inside, you wash your hands with soap and water. And when you go outside, a lot of times, you'll bend down and wash your hands with the dirt and be like, okay, I'm outside now. I'm ready to go on my hike. You know, it's like, it's a way of bathing in it or being in it in a way that is appreciative and respectful.
Absolutely. I mean, was and continues to be reduced into a frontier, right? That's the way that the land is perceived, and it's a distorting mythology, right?
It is. It's a distorting mythology.
And I think we are all the worse off for it. And one of the things that your book does is really give us this capacity to sit with that and to, you know, mourn. You know, it's everybody's grief that, yeah. So audience questions?
I forgot you guys were over here.
First of all, thank you for being here. It's a beautiful story. I look forward to reading it.
Thank you.
I'm curious, when you said at your grandmother's funeral, I believe, and the custom of the culture changed from the pit and the burning of everything. Can you talk just for a second about what did that do culturally to you, and did it have an impact because it was the BIA that was dictating it and not your own cultural desires necessarily that changed that?
Right. Well, it happened a little before when I was born. So if I hadn't heard the stories from my father and my uncles and aunts, I would never have known that we used to burn the house because I hadn't witnessed it. I had been to funerals where I saw that my aunts came in and my cousins came in and they had a truck and they had all of my uncle's clothing, the newspaper that he had been reading before he died, like everything. And we put it into this big pit and it was before the funeral, we burned everything that he had owned. Because the children are not supposed to they're not supposed to think of their parents as a way to receive material things, right? But then when I was in high school, my father was like, they're burning great-grandma's house. And I was like, why? And he said, because we used to do that all the time. That was the way but then when the federal government started to build our homes, like HUD homes, the value of the homes was too much. They didn't want us to destroy what they had spent money on. So they grandfathered in only people that had been born prior to a certain year. And again, people die pretty young that were born in the 1930s and 1940s due to the poverty and the stress of colonization. But my grandmother was a very fierce she was a medicine person. She was an herbalist. She lived until she was 87. So her house was the last house that was ever burned. And I mean, we didn't go to the funeral because my father was working overhaul, and I think he was just afraid to see it happen, honestly. And he was receiving calls from a lot of people who were saying, I saw your grandma's house burning, why are they doing that? And he was explaining it to them. But what it did impact was this, that when my grandfather was a leader, because he was the tribal president for a long time and he was the business manager, we had this big ceremony every year called the Karuk. It was one of the only ceremonial practices that we still lived and inhabited and did every year. And each clan had a different responsibility to bring to the ceremony. And the clan that brought the song, the Bird Clan, had a grandfather and a father that died within a week, one of the other, they were gone. And they had not passed the song on to the younger generation. That only, the next people in line were teenagers, and they had not learned the song. And so my grandfather and all of his generation of men went into a prayer meeting and considered what to do. And my dad told me this, my aunt told me this. They came out and they said, the ceremony is gone. We will never do it again. And everybody was outraged and said, how can you say this? And they said, the ceremony itself is a material thing. And if it has died naturally in this way, it means that it's no longer healing and creating what we want it to do. Otherwise, it would have not died. We're not going to grasp onto it because the ceremony and the song are material things. And I remember feeling so upset about that. And just recently, they have started to talk about trying to recover and regain that ceremony that was put down in the 1950s and hasn't been done now for 70 years. And I don't know if they'll be able to rejuvenate it, but that's the current talk, that maybe we should try to do it. But it's interesting to me that it's counter to the philosophy of the tribe itself, which certainly my ancestors saw big cities in Central America. They found cups with hot cocoa in them at Chaco when they excavated. At Cahokia Mounds in St. Louis, they find parrot feathers that were used in ceremony. There were trade routes going down into Central America and huge cities down there. Now they know because of LiDAR technology. But my tribe specifically had really chosen this very light way of living on the land. And it was not because they were not sophisticated enough to know that there were alternatives. It was a philosophical choice. And so, I think in any book that you write, for the book to really feel emotionally effective to the reader, the author herself has to engage in discoveries that destabilize and inform them in the way that they're living. And this book definitely, when I got about 2/3 of the way through and I realized the very act of writing this book is in some ways a contradiction to the tribal philosophies that I was raised to uphold, and I'm professing to try to be holding up a valorization of my tribal philosophies. It was very kind of destabilizing, and I thought, well, what other alternative do I have? And I'm happy that I did it, but to me, it speaks to what Leslie Marmon Silko says, who was from my tribe at Laguna Pueblo. She talks a lot about how language evolves, people evolve, even ceremonies have to evolve, or they no longer fit the needs of our society, and that we should not fear change, that change is in fact the very nature of being alive. Yeah.
There's a question in the back.
Just a comment. I'm struck by what you just said. I don't know if you're familiar with the documentary "The Language You Cry In," that's about the Gullah Geechee. Long story short, Edward Ball writes a book, Slaves in the Family. His best friend is a black man. He finds they're related. Anthropologists had been in Sierra Leone, where rice farmers had been taken to the Americas, and they asked him to come back with their people. He spends many years and finally realizes this relative of this former plantation owner's child is the link, and he ends up taking his daughter. And the process is they want to extend their culture. So it's a rural Sierra Leonese tribal family or community, and what they understood was the rent of enslavement stopped the conversation of orality with the history. Yeah. So when this woman came back, who really wasn't that in touch with her history, but she was of the bloodline, they had segments representing like each decade to orally tell her the history, so their history would have a continuity, because they knew it had been broken by having her be present.
Oh, yes.
So it's very interesting to hear what you just said in relation to this other way of thinking about what is the responsibility of the ancestors and their progeny.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because in some ways what I have done is taboo. And I have a friend, I work clearly with a lot of indigenous writers, from like Tommy Orange to Brandon Hobson, who has been here, to Layli Long Soldier. Joy Harjo got her degree at our institute. And my friend Ramona Emerson wrote a book that is about a photographer who films dead bodies for the police. And Diné people, Navajo people have a taboo about talking. Like, if you lose somebody in your family, you don't speak their name for years, because they have this major taboo about it, and she's breaking that taboo. In other words, I'm saying maybe it's time for us to think about changing. You know what I mean? That it's that there could be a different approach.
Which, to what you just said, some Aboriginal groups, when anthropologists have documented them, they can't see images of their deceased. And it's become a rift when people think they're being restorative and they're actually being destructive.
Well, at IAIA, we try, you know, the Institute of American Indian Arts is a contemporary art school, and it was built on a fissure, because when it was created, there was a guy named Floyd Kivanu who was working in indigenous fashion design and contemporary design in New York City, and he came back to the Pueblos and he said, why are our students all learning to replicate pottery and artwork that is exactly like it's been for the last 500 years? Why can they not riff off of old methodologies and old design to create new, innovative things? And some people in the tribes around us said, this is a horrific thing to tell kids to do. And the other half said, this is absolutely what we need to do. And there was a fissure, and that is barely becoming resolved now, you know. And I think one of the most important things for me to do in the field of literature is to talk to my students about how we can't arrive as a healthy body of literature unless we have narratives and counter-narratives. All cultures have narratives and counter-narratives on the bookshelves. We don't have to always agree about what we're doing aesthetically or ethically or how we're approaching our material. It's okay for us to have heated debates. It will be okay for people to push back against each other, even in their manuscripts. And so encouraging everyone to think that that is an important part of a vibrant, vital art movement is part of what I do.
We have a question from someone who's viewing on the web. He or she says, thank you for this beautiful reading and discussion. What has weaving your multiple identities, cultures, and heritages looked like for you as you pass them along to your children and grandchildren? How has that changed over the decades for you? As an aside, my mother is a Kwatsaan citizen and is a distant cousin of yours.
Oh.
I wish I had been able to come to this in person to meet you. Your book has been very meaningful in our branch of the Jackson family. Thank you.
Oh, that's so nice. What a special thing. It makes me so happy. I'm very tired of the narratives about half-breeds that treat us as tragic. I think even in the work of Erik Erikson, who I talked about, the guy that coined the term identity crisis, he says that forestalling a solid identity in some people does become a struggle, but in other people it creates creative genius. Do you know what I mean? And so I stand on the threshold between many rooms, and I can pivot to look at one, and I can pivot to look at the other, and I can pivot to look at the third. And I've become comfortable with that where I am now. At the same time, I know that my children have struggled because they're very comfortable at the Uffizi galleries and they're very comfortable at a powwow, and those two worlds are completely different, one from the other. And I know that it's been painful for them. I think it's really important that Native kids know that it's a wonderful thing for them to engage in careers and vocations that attempt to right the wrongs of history. So I have a daughter who is a lawyer who does a lot of indigenous law and environmental law. She got a dual degree in environmental sciences and law. And I have another daughter that works in public health with Native Hawaiians, which is and then I have a son who's a computer scientist. And I tell him all the time, I'm like, if you have joy in your life, joy is a form of resistance for someone from your history. Because we were never expected to be happy. We were not supposed to be functional, in healthy relationships, go home from your job and spend time with your family, go for a walk. I'm like, I want Native kids to make choices for themselves. Writing this book is not my way of saying to Native children, I'm going to place even more weight on your shoulders and tell you that you must find a career that is in some way doing what I do. Because not everybody has the capacity to do that. And so living a functional life, being healthy, taking care of the people that you love, experiencing joy daily, I think that makes our ancestors look down and smile on them. I really do, And I want to encourage that. I had an interviewer who told me, this book is teaching kids how not to assimilate. And I'm like, no, this book is showing people how I grappled with this spiritual crisis of trying to figure out how I could be a tribal citizen in a capitalist world, because those are opposing value systems. And I think all indigenous kids, they have that spiritual crisis where they're like, my teachers are telling me to look out for number one, to get out there, to compete, to create a career, to build my bank account. But then my grandma back on the Pueblo is telling me that I have to find a way to give to the tribe and give to the families and be generous and caring. And figuring out what feels honest to you is of paramount importance to your mental health. And that's my primary concern with kids, is that their mental health survive the pressures of this current political era. And so for me, I think some leniency, some understanding, and some reassurance that they're doing it right if they're taking care of themselves is of primary. And then they have to build their own identity. I can't hand it to them, just like my parents couldn't give me mine. They pushed and they wanted, and I became who I was by virtue of my own choices and my own value system. And everyone deserves to create their own sort of way of being in the world.
Yeah. And it's also not two choices, assimilate or be anti-assimilate,
No.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what this book does. And, I in some ways it resonated with me because I've gone through that struggle. And for a long time, it just felt like I was like split in two. And then I eventually got to a place through writing where you can exist in the paradox and you can exist in the contradiction. And you can pick and choose which aspects, and you don't have to justify your choices and your humanity to anybody, right?
Yes.
And I think that you live through that experience, right? And the book is a reckoning with that, and eventually getting to a place where the past, the present, and the future coexist in one spatial dimension.
Yeah.
Which is such a beautiful place to arrive at. But you went through the struggle to get there.
Yeah.
And there's a moment in the book that's really powerful where your dad turns to you and you're like, you need to be an individual, which is also difficult to receive coming from a community-oriented culture where individualism is maybe not regarded as like the optimal characteristic to have, right?
I know, that's right. He was very brave in that. I think he knew he had to become an individual. I mean, I think some people don't make it because they don't feel comfortable doing that,
Yeah, he gave you permission.
Yeah, he did. He gave me permission.
Yeah. And Nikita, did I see your hand up? No. Okay. I think, yes, thank you so much. We're at time and we have a reception upstairs, and I know Deborah will be happy to sign books. And
if you had one. Okay.
Yeah, answer
The
any other
bookstore has the
questions.
books for sale upstairs.
Yes,
as
the
well.
book is for sale,
you so much
please
for
buy
coming.
and get a copy signed.